Okay, well, welcome everyone to Cybernetic Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present, and future of cybernetics. In the next 20 to 30 minutes, our speaker will be covering an answer to 4 questions regarding their thoughts on cybernetics, its past, its present, and future. They're the same 4 questions that we'll be asking all of our speakers. Following the session, you'll be able to find a recording plus a snack pack of resources related to the talk to take home and devour on our website. To keep it focused and on time, there won't be time for audience questions here, but you'll see that we've disabled the chat to limit distractions. So straight after the talk, our speaker will join our PhD students in their ratio club for a Q&A. For everyone else, we encourage you to create opportunities in your own communities to continue the conversation. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are speaking with you today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Now, we've got a lot of incredible people involved in the series, and today is no exception. Today, we're in conversation with Dr. Tara Abraham. Dr. Abraham researches the history of biomedicine, psychiatry, and American science. She has taught at York University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, Germany, and the Dibner Institute for History of Science and Technology at MIT. So let's get started. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to offer my own land acknowledgement. I'm a settler working at the University of Guelph in a city that has been built over rich Indigenous histories. And the University of Guelph exists on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee peoples. The city of Guelph falls within the bounds of the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3, agreed upon by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Crown in 1792. And I acknowledge that Canada only exists in its current form due to the continued settler occupation of traditional unceded and/or treaty lands of many Indigenous peoples. I'd really like to thank Jessica and Bill for the invitation to speak with you today. It's not often that I get to talk to practitioners in an area of science that I've been interested in as a historian for many years. And I wanted to add a disclaimer. Although your questions address the past, present, and future of cybernetics, my own comfort zone, the areas in which I research and teach, are focused on the past. So the first question, why cybernetics? I first encountered cybernetics as a PhD student at the University of Toronto, now over 25 years ago. And I was working on my dissertation that looked at the history of theoretical modeling in 20th century biology. That's what I found quite interesting, and I wanted to give it a historical focus. I wanted to figure out how and why scientists in the 20th century used models as a scientific practice and how they use those models to make sense of complex processes such as gene regulation and biological development. And interestingly, I found that a lot of the modelers in biology were actually influenced by early work in cybernetics. So once I completed my dissertation, I found that the most interesting part of my PhD story was a figure whose early work modeled neuron function, and that was the work of cybernetician Warren S McCulloch. So I spent the next several years, too many that I'd like to admit, on a brand new philosophical project that placed McCulloch in his scientific, philosophical, and historical context. And that research resulted in my book pictured here. That's my shameless plug, Rebel Genius, Warren S McCulloch's Transdisciplinary Life in Science. And I'll speak more about that transdisciplinary life in a moment. So this book, of course, leads to my answer to your second question. So I'm definitely comfortable talking about the past of cybernetics. And after spending many years researching McCulloch and thinking about him and writing about him, he has become, in answer to your question, my favorite person from cybernetics, particularly the past. And I find McCulloch fascinating. Although he did not win a Nobel Prize, he did not discover the answer to any huge scientific questions. What interested me about McCulloch and what I find still interesting about him is that he asked big scientific questions. And that, I think, is the mark of a really original scientist. He ultimately changed the way that scientists thought about the brain, the mind, and the relations between them. And he also inspired many to develop models of neuron function that could capture the functioning of the brain and define new models of how the brain and mind work together. So, who was McCulloch? McCulloch is best known actually as a pioneer in American cybernetics, as it emerged in the 1940s and 1950s. And I would say he was its most colorful figure. And here he's pictured in a photograph from the 10th meeting of the Macy conferences on cybernetics, which took place in New York between 1946 and 1953. McCulloch was not only instrumental in organizing these meetings, but he also chaired the meetings as well. And the meetings brought together a myriad of engineers, physicists, mathematicians, biologists, and medical practitioners to explore the potential of using negative feedback as a way of making sense of both natural and artificial systems. And throughout all of this, McCulloch, kind of at the center of this group, fashioned himself as driven by a singular philosophical problem, the relationship between the brain and the mind. And in his pursuit of this goal, McCulloch rejected a lot of the academic and disciplinary conventions that defined science in the first half of the 20th century. He spent the first 2 decades of his life studying the brain, and despite shifts in his career path, the brain and how it worked always remained at the core of his intellectual pursuits, even his work as a cybernetician. So I'm just going to go over this briefly. This is basically, a kind of a snapshot of McCulloch's career path. And it actually, although I would say he was kind of a radical scientist, a maverick in many ways, his career path was not especially radical. He began his intellectual life as an undergraduate in philosophy and psychology at Yale in 1918. He graduated in 1921. He then got an MA in psychology from Columbia, an MD from Columbia, where he specialized in neurology. And then he worked at Bellevue Hospital in New York City in experimental neurology. He did work as a psychiatrist at the Rockland State Hospital in New York. And then he worked in the neurophysiology lab of Dussel de Beren, the Dutch neurophysiologist at Yale. Following this, he began work as a neuropsychiatrist at the Illinois Neuropsychiatric Institute in Chicago. And finally, he landed and spent the last few decades of his life as a research scientist at the Research Laboratory of Electronics at MIT. And I've highlighted the different disciplinary homes that McCulloch found himself in throughout his life, ranging from philosophy and psychology to medicine and neurology, psychiatry, and finally engineering. So as he matured as a scientist, McCulloch, I would say, was frustrated at what he saw as an overemphasis on empirical studies of the brain. So just to go back here, I mean, he's kind of earning his keep in squarely in medicine, neurology, neurophysiology, and psychiatry. But what he wanted in studies of the nervous system and the relevance of studies of the nervous system for medicine and psychiatry was more room for theoretical speculation and theoretical modeling. So in 1943, working with Walter Pitts, a mathematical prodigy, he produced his now classic paper on that purported to embody logical thought in the on-off nature of neural activity. And then later in 1947, Pitts and McCulloch presented a hypothetical model of the functional relations between neurons that, in their view, achieved recognition of universal forms, such as the perception of the form triangle, regardless of size or context. For both models and the way he presented them at the Macy conferences, McCulloch received a lot of criticism from empirically minded psychologists and psychiatrists who chastised him for his so-called as-if spirit. And neither of those models really held up to empirical scrutiny ultimately. But McCulloch, through taking these risks, McCulloch helped move the brain out of medicine into an object of scientific study. And by the end of the 20th century, the brain was no longer limited to the purview of neurology or neurophysiology, but it became a focus in engineering, in mathematics, and beyond. And in part, a lot of McCulloch's theoretical speculation is kind of captured in the title of this 1948 paper, Why the Mind is in the Head. In a way, he was trying to solve this problem through modeling the brain. So McCulloch was a very colorful figure, and I had to include this quote because it captures in some ways the very transdisciplinary life he lived, but also how he became a very fascinating figure for those around him. So in 1949, Robert Morrison, who was medical officer of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, described McCulloch as a slender, lithe, bearded figure who leaps to the blackboard to diagram what he is telling you, who sees the human nervous system as a living net of 10 billion automatic relays, the biological analog of an electronic calculator, and who, for relaxation, writes sonnets. His present preoccupation is brain chemistry. So to give you some conclusions, and I'm really giving you kind of an overview of the conclusions that I drew in my book, which was really a biography of McCulloch that tried to place McCulloch in his context and trace his life, because he ended up doing really important work in very conspicuous fields in 20th century brain and mind sciences. So following him through his kind of trajectory gave me a lot of context and to flesh out what was going on around him. So I present McCulloch as kind of a true transdisciplinary scientist. And in light of this trajectory that took him from neurophysiology to psychology, psychiatry, cybernetics, and engineering, his colleague and friend, Ralph Gerard, in his obituary of McCulloch, called him a rebel genius. And in my book, I don't take that at face value. I try to unpack it. But my main conclusions were the following. So through the lens of McCulloch, cybernetics, I mean, his life tells us a lot about the history of cybernetics. Cybernetics emerges as as having an important origin in medicine, in scientific philosophy, and mathematics. We often think of cybernetics as emerging from, the anti-aircraft predictor of Norbert Wiener, or military machines, and the field being about control and communication. But through the lens of McCulloch, cybernetics has important origins and ties to medicine and scientific philosophy and mathematical biology, or at least theoretical modeling. And while that theoretical modeling was at the heart of McCulloch's vision, he spent most of his career in the worlds of neurophysiology and psychiatry. So, he was operating at a time when cybernetics as a pursuit or as a field of study didn't really exist. And so his story kind of gives us a sense of some of the threads that went into cybernetics. And that really motivated his modeling. He thought that if psychiatry was going to work, it needed to be rooted in the science of the brain. He also had a lot of obstacles. I mean, his contemporaries at those Macy meetings when McCulloch would speak were highly critical of what he was doing in the early senses, because often he was deliberately loose in his rhetorical style. And He used terms from different disciplines in an ambiguous way to try to unify the field. And he also used models that some found problematic, that he assumed too many. He used, as I said earlier, this as if spirit. His models were too speculative, too difficult to test empirically. But at the same time, McCulloch was an important mentor to so many that followed him. He inspired a new crop of modelers that, although, his own models failed to incorporate a lot of empirical data, he was judged by his peers and his proteges as a brilliant and very inspiring figure who raised a generation of theoretically minded brain researchers. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, I think through McCulloch, the brain becomes this transdisciplinary object, no longer confined to medicine or physiology. And it now today sits at the nexus of the cognitive sciences, philosophy, linguistics, neuroscience, and engineering. So next to the present. And as you might guess, as when I think of cybernetics today and how it, I'm firmly ensconced in a history department here at the University of Guelph. And so when I think of cybernetics today, my thoughts first turn to work in artificial intelligence. And I know that is but one facet of cybernetics. And I do think that AI has a really complicated and sometimes misunderstood relations to the origins of cybernetics. Certainly the AI researchers of the 1950s and 60s, like John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky, focused on developing artificial systems that might exhibit what we might call intelligent behavior, learning, decision making, perception, sensation, memory, and so on. And today AI work does much the same, and perhaps much more. And I would argue that it's really hard to ignore the presence of AI in the world around us. Some even argue that we're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution, a mingling of the digital, the physical, and the biological worlds that really, influence all aspects of our lives, from, psychotherapy to manufacturing to teaching to writing, communication, and so on. And I know that AI has enormous promise and potential to make our lives better, and it does. But it also poses a lot of challenges. From a historical viewpoint, I would say the same can be said of any technology, many new technologies. Um, for myself and my colleagues in the humanities, many of us have been concerned by the difficulties of generative AI for the core practices and skills that we teach our students. Things like critical thinking, critical reading, and critical writing. The use of OpenAI's ChatGPT, for example, in my own institution has really transformed the way we teach, the way we evaluate students, and our pedagogy. And recently I learned that OpenAI has developed a new reasoning model called Deep Research, which promises to literally do research that can answer quite high level questions. And it leads to my colleague, Mark Humphreys, to ask, is this the last generation of historians? So this, I would argue, doesn't just affect humanists or historians, but it has implications for how all of us perform research. And it's the most vivid example of cybernetics that I see today, at least in my day-to-day life. So lastly, to cybernetics future. And interestingly, as you see from this image of Norbert Wiener, and I'm not sure how well you can see it, but because all of the people windows are covering it for me. But so I was asked if I could name a thing that I would either add or do differently in shaping a cybernetics for the 21st century. And this is not meant to be.
She'll do that. Yeah, right. If this one still works,
this is not meant to be a critique, but it is meant to highlight the potential for history and the humanities to partner with cyberneticians or to partner with people that practice in cybernetics. I tell my engineering students all the time, and I teach a lot of I teach history to a lot of engineering students, history of science and technology. Um, and I tell them that history is a powerful tool for tackling some of the world's biggest scientific challenges. And I think history can also help cybernetic practice by addressing and helping to highlight some of the ethical and philosophical challenges that cybernetics presents. And so this is what I would add to help shape cybernetics for the future, to forge more alliances, institutional alliances across disciplinary boundaries, particularly those between the sciences and the humanities. And I already know that cybernetics at ANU is already doing this. But this is in fact a call from another of cybernetics' most key historical figures, and that is the MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener. So the period when cybernetics emerged in the 40s and 50s was a key phase for American science and medicine, broadly speaking. The Second World War had generated new alliances between science, medicine, and the state. And some, like Norbert Wiener, for some, like Norbert Wiener, the goal-directed behavior of the then new devices, such as the anti-aircraft predictor, the digital computer, and so on, these devices held enormous promise for making sense of goal-directed phenomena in living things. But ultimately, Wiener was quite disturbed by the moral and ethical implications of cybernetics, both as a generator of problems, but also a solver of problems. And in the wake of World War II and the proliferation of atomic weapons, for example, Wiener ultimately boycotted government-funded research, and he wrote prolifically about the moral role of the scientist and the implications of the, quote, fabulous monsters of this Cold War era, particularly the links between cybernetics military systems and political will that characterized the period. And he wrote about these things in a book that was published in 1950 called The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society. Here, Wiener feared that the time and labor-saving devices of his era, and I've just mentioned a few moments ago some of the time and labor-saving devices that we use today, but those devices that automate tasks that previously were performed by humans would lead to large-scale unemployment, replacement of workers. And he felt a sense of sadness surrounding the cybernetic technologies that he helped birth. He saw potential loss of humanity. He lamented the possibility, and this is a very Cold War arms race era kind of statement, but he lamented the possibility that a person, and I quote here, might calmly transfer to the machine the responsibility for his choice of good and evil without continuing to accept full responsibility for that choice. So he believed that the machine's danger was not from the machine itself, but from what man or humanity makes of the machine. And indeed, you know, Wiener felt the essence of humanity was under threat. How can we mitigate these dangers? Well, Wiener believed that to avoid these dangers, humanistic reflection is important. And so here he talks about the differences between know-how and know-what. Our papers have been making a great deal of American know-how, meaning newspapers, ever since we had the misfortune to discover the atomic bomb. And there is one quality more important than know-how, and this is know-what, by which we determine not only how to accomplish our purposes, but what our purposes are to be or ought to be. So as I said, I mean, Wiener was writing in the shadow of the arms race, and perhaps in a very different context than we are in today. And cybernetics itself looks very different than it did in the 1950s. But some of Wiener's fears surrounding automation, I would say, are still relevant today. And so for my vision of a cybernetic future, I do hope that cross-disciplinary collaboration between humanists, philosophers, historians, and others can help cyberneticians and work alongside them to tackle some of the deep questions that arise from practices like artificial intelligence. And that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. That was amazing. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. If you'd like to know more about anything that Tara has spoken about, there will be resources in the snack pack, which will be available on the website. I'd like to personally thank you, Tara. I really look forward to reading your book, Rebel Genius. And I think that this particular presentation that you've done has really brought up for me the importance of thinking about those bigger scientific questions and forging more alliances between the sciences and humanities. So the experience isn't over for our speaker and PhD students who are now off to another room to have a more informal discussion about all things cybernetics. To the rest of you online, thank you for joining us and see you next time, where we'll be encountering a very different perspective again. Thank you.